I knew something was wrong the moment his mother called me family before I even said my name. The word family shouldn't feel like a locked door, but standing in the marble foyer of the Carter estate, it did, heavy and final, like something had just clicked into place behind me. I forced a laugh, light, casual, like this was all still part of the deal, like I hadn't just stepped into a house that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread instead of real life. One week, I reminded myself. 7 days of pretending to be engaged to Alexander Carter, billionaire CEO, human iceberg, and the man currently resting his hand at the small of my back like it belonged there. Relax, he murmured under his breath, his voice low enough that only I could hear, steady and controlled in a way that made my pulse do something annoying and inconvenient. You're doing fine. Fine. Right. Because nothing says fine like fake engagement dinners with people who could probably buy and sell my entire life before dessert. I smiled when his mother reached for my hands, her grip warm, deliberate, her eyes sharp in a way that made it feel like she was reading things I hadn't even said out loud. "We've been waiting to meet you," she said, and there was something about the way she said waiting that didn't sit right. Like this wasn't spontaneous, like I hadn't just been hired a week ago to fill a temporary role. I glanced at Alex, expecting some sign, some subtle cue that said this was normal, but his expression didn't change. It never did. That was the problem. He looked at me the same way he looked at everything else, controlled, measured, impossible to read. Dinner blurred into questions I wasn't prepared for, details about our relationship that I hadn't been given time to memorize, and every time I hesitated, Alex filled in the gaps seamlessly, like he'd been telling this story longer than a week. His fingers brushed mine under the table once, just once, but it lingered longer than necessary, a quiet pressure that steadied me and unsettled me at the same time. By the time dessert was served, I wasn't sure what part of this was still fake. And then came the moment that changed. Everything. His father raised a glass, calm, composed, and said, "We're glad you finally decided to stay." Stay? The word landed wrong, heavy in my chest. I blinked, forcing a smile, assuming it was just polite exaggeration, rich people being dramatic for no reason. But then Alex turned to me, and for the first time all night, something shifted in his expression, something softer, something almost dangerous. His thumb brushed against the ring on my finger, slow, intentional. "He's not going anywhere," Alex said quietly. And I laughed again, because I had to, because that's what you do when things start slipping out of control. But later that night, alone in a guest room that was too big, too quiet, too permanent, I found the document I'd signed earlier that week, the one I hadn't bothered to read carefully, because who reads fake contracts for fake relationships? My name was there. His name was there. And at the top, in bold, undeniable print, were the words, "Marriage License Application, State of California." My stomach dropped. My pulse stuttered. And suddenly, 1 week didn't feel temporary anymore. I did not breathe for a full 3 seconds after reading it, like maybe if I stayed still enough, the words would rearrange themselves into something less catastrophic, something that made sense in the version of reality I thought I was living in. But they did not. They stayed exactly the same, sharp and official and very, very real, and my name did not look like mine anymore. Just letters attached to a decision I did not remember making, my fingers tightening around the paper as the quiet of the room pressed in on me, too big, too clean, too permanent, like the walls already knew I was not leaving. I laughed once, soft and disbelieving, because of course this had to be some kind of mistake, a legal form mix-up, a rich family quirk, something I could walk downstairs and fix with an awkward apology and a quick explanation. Except deep down, something colder was already settling in my chest, something that whispered that nothing about this house felt accidental. The door clicked softly behind me, and I froze, the sound slicing through the silence as I turned slowly, already knowing who it would be before I saw him, because no one else in this place moved that quietly, that deliberately. Alex leaned against the door like he had been there longer than I realized, like he had been watching me, his gaze dropping briefly to the paper in my hands before lifting back to my face, unreadable as ever, and somehow that made it worse. "Tell me this is a joke," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt, which was impressive considering my heart was trying to punch its way out of my chest. He did not answer right away, and the pause stretched, thin and tight, until it snapped. You should have read it, he said finally, calm, not defensive, not apologetic, just matter of fact, like we were discussing something small, like a missed email or a scheduling error. I stared at him, waiting for the part where he explained, where he fixed this, where he told me this was still a 1-week arrangement and I could walk away at the end of it with my dignity and my life intact. But that part never came. This is not what we agreed to, I said, taking a step toward him, the paper shaking slightly in my hand despite my best effort to keep it still. His eyes tracked the movement, then flicked back up, sharp and focused in a way that made my stomach twist. We agreed you would play the role, he replied, pushing off the door and stepping closer. And suddenly the space between us felt smaller, charged, like the air had thickened. I never said how far it needed to go. The words landed heavier than they should have, because they were technically true, and I hated that. Hated how easily he could stand there and reshape the rules like they had always belonged to him. Your family thinks I am staying, I said, quieter now, the earlier edge slipping into something more uncertain, because that was the part that scared me, not the paper, not the legality, but the way his mother had smiled at me like I was already part of something I did not understand. Alex's gaze softened for a fraction of a second, so quick I almost missed it, his hand lifting like he was about to reach for me before he stopped himself, fingers curling slightly instead. They believe what I tell them, he said, his voice lower now, closer, the distance between us narrowing until I could feel the heat of him, steady and controlled, completely at odds with the chaos in my chest. I swallowed, my grip tightening on the document as I searched his face for something. Anything that would tell me this was still under control, that I still had a way out. But all I found was that same quiet certainty. And what exactly did you tell them? I asked, and this time, when he looked at me, there was no hesitation at all. That you are not temporary, he said, and the words settled into the space between us like something final, something that did not plan on changing anytime soon. And for the first time since I stepped into this house, I realized the problem was not that I had walked into a situation I did not understand. It was that I might have already gone too far to walk back out. I should have walked out right then. That is the part that keeps replaying in my head, clear and obvious and painfully logical, because any sane person would have looked at that document, looked at him, and left before things got any more complicated. But the problem was nothing about this felt simple anymore. Not the house, not the contract. Not the way Alex was standing so close that I could feel the warmth of him even when he was not touching me. Like proximity alone was enough to blur the line between what was real and what was supposed to be pretend. You cannot just decide that for me, I said, and my voice came out sharper this time, steadier, because if I let myself slip into uncertainty again, I knew I would lose whatever ground I still had left. His gaze did not waver, steady and intent in a way that made it impossible to ignore, like he had already considered every outcome and chosen this one anyway. I did not decide it alone, he replied, and that was worse, because it meant this had been planned, discussed, agreed upon in rooms I had never been in, conversations I had never heard, my life apparently a detail that could be arranged without my input. I shook my head, taking a step back, needing space, needing air, but even that felt limited in a room that suddenly seemed too carefully designed, too curated, like every piece of furniture had been placed with intention, including me. Then undo it, I said, holding up the paper like evidence, like something he could simply fix if he chose to. Call whoever you need to call, and tell them it was a mistake. For a second, just a second, something flickered in his expression, something that almost looked like frustration, or maybe conflict, but it disappeared so quickly I could not be sure I had seen it at all. It is not that simple, he said, quieter now, and that tone, that shift, made something in my chest tighten because it sounded less like control and more like truth. I let out a breath that felt heavier than it should have, my fingers loosening slightly around the document as the reality of the situation settled in layers instead of all at once, slow and suffocating. It was supposed to be 1 week, I said. Softer now, not arguing, not demanding, just stating something that already felt like it belonged to a different version of this story. His eyes dropped briefly to my hand, to the paper, then back up, and this time when he stepped closer, I did not move away fast enough, or maybe I did not want to, which was worse. His hand hovered near mine for a second before he gently took the document from my grip. Not forceful, not aggressive, just certain, like he had every right to do it. It still is, he said, but there was something in the way he said it that made it clear the definition of 1 week had changed in ways I did not understand. Then why does it feel like I am already stuck here? I asked, and I hated how honest that sounded, how much it revealed, because I was not supposed to feel stuck. I was supposed to be in control, to remember this was a job, a temporary arrangement, something I could walk away from. His thumb brushed lightly against the edge of the paper, slow, thoughtful, before he set it down on the table beside us, like it was no longer the most important thing in the room. Because you are not used to this kind of life, he said, and that almost made me laugh, because it was not the house or the money or the family that made this feel like a trap. It was him, the way he looked at me like I was already part of something bigger than myself, something I had not agreed to but was somehow being pulled into anyway. I crossed my arms, a weak attempt at creating distance that did not actually exist, and met his gaze head on. Then let me go back to mine, I said. Simple, direct, the kind of sentence that should have ended the conversation, but Alex just looked at me, quiet and steady, and after a moment, he shook his head slightly, almost like he regretted it, almost like he knew what that answer would do. You can, he said, and for a second, relief flickered, quick and fragile, until he added, but not yet. And just like that, the door I thought I had was still there, still visible, but somehow farther away than it had been before. Not yet, I repeated, and the words felt strange in my mouth, like they did not belong to me, like I had somehow stepped into a conversation where the ending had already been written and I was just catching up. Alex did not answer immediately, and that silence stretched again, familiar now, controlled, deliberate, the kind that made you fill in the gaps yourself, usually with the worst possible conclusion. I let out a quiet breath, forcing myself to step back, to put space between us before I forgot that. I was supposed to be pushing against this, not leaning into it. You keep saying things like that, I said, my voice lower now, more careful, because something about this situation demanded it, like speaking too loudly might make it more real, like I do not actually get a choice. His gaze followed me as I moved, steady and unblinking, but he did not try to close the distance this time, which somehow made it worse, like he did not need to, like he already knew I was not going anywhere. You do have a choice, he said finally, and there it was again, that calm certainty that made everything sound reasonable even when it was not. I let out a short, disbelieving laugh, shaking my head as I turned away from him, pacing once across the room, my sneakers too quiet against the polished floor, like even my footsteps were being swallowed by this place. Then it is a terrible one, I muttered, running a hand through my hair, trying to steady the thoughts that kept circling back to the same point. The same realization that this was no longer something I could walk away from with a simple goodbye. The room felt different now, less like a guest space and more like something waiting to be lived in. The neatly arranged furniture, the closet that was already half filled with clothes that were not mine when I arrived, details I had brushed off earlier but could not ignore anymore. You planned this, I said, turning back to him, the words landing heavier now that I could see the pattern, the way everything had been set up before I even stepped through the front door. His jaw tightened slightly, not enough to break that composed exterior, but enough to tell me I was not wrong. I prepared, he corrected, and that was worse. Because preparation meant intention, meant time, meant this had been in motion long before I agreed to anything. I stared at him, searching for something in his expression, some sign that this was all strategy, all calculation, something I could hate him for easily, something clean and simple, but what I found instead was something more complicated, something quieter, and that unsettled me more than anything else. Why me? I asked, and this time the question came out softer, less defensive, more honest than I meant it to be. His gaze shifted slightly at that, not away, but inward, like he was choosing his answer carefully, like it mattered more than the rest of this conversation. For a moment, I thought he might deflect, might give me something vague and safe, but instead he took a step closer again, slow enough that I could have moved away if I wanted to, if I had remembered to. Because you were the only one who did not look at me like you already wanted something, he said, his voice quieter now, closer, and that answer landed differently, not sharp, not controlling, but steady in a way that made it harder to push back against. I blinked, caught off guard, because that was not the answer I expected, not the answer that fit into the version of him I had built in my head. "So you decided to trap me instead," I said, trying to regain footing, to pull the conversation back into something I understood. His expression shifted then, something almost like regret flickering across it before settling into something firmer. "I decided not to let something real walk away," he replied. And the words hung there between us, heavier than anything he had said before, because they did not sound like strategy, they sounded like conviction. I swallowed, my pulse unsteady, because that was the problem. That was the exact problem. This was supposed to be fake, simple, temporary, and instead it was turning into something layered and complicated and dangerously close to real. And I did not know when that shift had started or how to stop it now that it had. "Something real does not feel like a contract I did not agree to," I said. And this time there was no sharp edge, no raised voice, just a quiet steadiness that surprised even me. Because somewhere between the panic and the confusion, something else had started to settle in, something slower and heavier, like I was beginning to understand the shape of what I was standing inside. Alex did not respond right away, and I watched him. Really watched him this time, the way his shoulders held tension. He pretended was not there, the way his gaze stayed fixed on me like looking away would mean losing something. And that thought alone made my chest tighten in a way I did not want to examine too closely. "Then tell me what it is supposed to feel like," he said, and there was something different in his voice now, something less controlled, less certain, like for once he was not entirely ahead of the situation. I let out a slow breath, glancing down at my hand, at the ring that still sat there, like it had always belonged, catching the light in a way that felt too deliberate, too intentional, and I resisted the urge to take it off, because I had a feeling it would not be as simple as slipping it free. "It is supposed to feel like a choice," I answered finally, lifting my eyes back to his, holding his gaze even when it would have been easier not to, like I walked into it knowing what I was getting into, not like I was guided there without realizing it. The words hung between us, heavier than I expected, and for a moment neither of us moved, the silence stretching but not snapping this time, just settling into something quieter, something that felt less like a standoff and more like a pause neither of us knew how to break. Alex exhaled slowly, the tension in his posture easing just enough to notice, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer, not weak, not uncertain, just honest in a way I had not heard from him before. "If I had told you everything, you would have said no," he said, and there it was, simple and direct and impossible to argue with, because he was right, and we both knew it. I swallowed, my fingers curling slightly at my sides as I absorbed that, because it shifted something, not enough to make this okay, but enough to make it complicated in a way that was harder to reject outright. "That does not make this better," I said, quieter now, because I was not trying to win an argument anymore. I was trying to understand where the line had blurred and why I had not seen it sooner. "I know," he replied, and the lack of defense in that answer caught me off guard more than anything else he had said. I blinked, thrown for a second, because I had expected justification, expected him to double down, to reinforce the logic of what he had done, but instead he just stood there, acknowledging it, and somehow that made it harder to push him away. My gaze drifted briefly to the door, still closed, still right there, the same door I had walked through earlier without hesitation, before everything had shifted into something heavier, something that felt less like a visit and more like a beginning I had not agreed to. "So what happens now?" I asked, and this time the question felt real, not rhetorical, not defensive, just something I needed answered because standing still was no longer an option. Alex followed my glance to the door and then back to me, his expression unreadable again, but softer at the edges, like something had shifted for him too. He took a step closer, not enough to crowd me, just enough to close the distance slightly, and when he spoke, his voice was steady again, but not cold. "Now," he said, his eyes holding mine in a way that made it hard to look away, "we do what we said we would do." And for a second I almost laughed, because that sounded simple, almost normal, until he added, quieter this time, "We make them believe it is real." And that was the problem. That had always been the problem, because somewhere along the way, I was not sure I was pretending anymore. "Make them believe it is real." I repeated under my breath after he left, the words lingering in the quiet like they were trying to settle into something permanent, something I could not just shake off. The door clicked softly behind him, and for the first time since I stepped into this house, I was alone, truly alone, but it did not feel like freedom. It felt like being left in the middle of something unfinished, something already in motion without me. I looked down at my hand again, at the ring that caught the soft light from the bedside lamp, turning it slightly with my thumb like that might reveal something hidden, some flaw, some sign that it was temporary. But it did not budge. It sat there perfectly, like it had always been mine. I exhaled slowly, crossing the room and stopping in front of the mirror. And for a second, I did not recognize the person staring back at me, not because I looked different, but because something about the way I stood, the way I held myself, had shifted without me noticing. "You are not staying," I muttered to my reflection, quiet but firm, like saying it out loud would make it true, like I could anchor myself to that decision before everything else pulled me in deeper. But even as I said it, the words felt thin, like they did not have enough weight to hold against everything else pressing in around me. A soft knock at the door broke the moment, gentle but deliberate, and before I could respond, it opened just enough for a woman in a neatly pressed uniform to step inside, her posture straight, her expression polite but not distant. "Mr. Blake," she said with a small, respectful nod. "Dinner will be served in 30 minutes, and Mrs. Carter has asked if you would join her beforehand." I blinked, caught off guard by how naturally my name sounded in this space, like it belonged here, like I belonged here, and that thought alone made my stomach tighten. "Of course," I replied automatically, because that seemed like the only response that fit, even though part of me wanted to say no, to refuse, to push back in any way I could. She offered a faint smile before stepping back out, the door closing quietly behind her, leaving me in that same too large, too quiet room with the echo of something I had not agreed to but was already participating in. I hesitated for a moment, then moved toward the closet, pulling it open slowly. And there it was again, that same unsettling detail, rows of clothing that fit my size, my style, pieces I would have chosen myself if I had the kind of budget that made choices like this effortless. My fingers brushed over the fabric of a shirt, soft and new, tags already removed, like it had been waiting for me specifically, and I swallowed hard, the realization settling deeper this time, heavier, harder to ignore. This was not improvisation. This was preparation. This was something that had been built step by step until it felt seamless, until it felt inevitable. I closed the closet slowly, leaning my forehead against the cool wood for a second, grounding myself in something solid, something real, before straightening up again. "1 week," I whispered, quieter. This time, more like a promise than a statement, because I needed something to hold on to, some boundary that had not been rewritten yet. But as I stepped out into the hallway, the soft lighting guiding the way, the distant sound of voices drifting up from downstairs, warm and welcoming in a way that felt too practiced, I could not shake the feeling that the line between pretending and becoming had already started to blur, and I was not sure which side I was standing on anymore. The hallway felt longer on the way down, like each step was stretching time just enough for doubt to settle deeper under my skin, and I kept my hand lightly against the railing, grounding myself in something physical as. The quiet hum of conversation grew clearer with every step. By the time I reached the last stair, I could already see them gathered in the living room, warm lights spilling across polished floors, voices soft and familiar in a way that made my chest tighten, because I was not supposed to fit into this picture so easily, and yet somehow I already did. "There you are," Mrs. Carter said the moment she noticed me, her smile immediate, effortless, like she had been expecting me specifically, not just someone filling a role, and that difference mattered more than I wanted it to. I forced a small smile in return, stepping forward, aware of every movement, every glance, every detail that might give me away if I was not careful. But no one seemed suspicious. No one seemed uncertain. They looked at me like I belonged here, like I had always been part of this space. "I hope you are settling in comfortably," she continued, her hand briefly resting over mine in a gesture that felt both kind and deliberate, like she was reinforcing something unspoken. "It is very comfortable," I replied, choosing my words carefully, because anything else would have sounded like resistance, and resistance felt dangerous here in ways I could not fully explain. Her eyes softened at that, satisfied, like I had given the right answer, and I hated how easy that was, how natural it felt to fall into the rhythm of this place. Good, she said, her voice warm. Because this is your home now, even if it is just for a little while. For a second, I almost corrected her, almost reminded her that this was temporary, that I was leaving, that none of this was real, but the words caught somewhere in my throat and never made it out, because the way she said it did not sound temporary at all. Ethan. Alex's voice came from behind me, calm and steady, and I turned slightly as he stepped closer, his presence immediate, grounding and unsettling at the same time, like he had a way of shifting the entire room. Without raising his voice, his hand brushed lightly against my lower back, subtle enough that no one else would question it, but intentional enough that I felt it, every inch of it, the warmth, the quiet pressure, the message behind it that said stay, play along, do not break this. I swallowed, forcing myself to relax into the contact instead of pulling away, because pulling away would mean explaining, and explaining would mean unraveling everything we had already built. We are about to sit down for dinner, he added, his tone easy, natural, like this was routine, like we had done this 100 times before. I nodded, glancing between him and his family. The scene so seamless it almost felt rehearsed, like I had stepped into a script that everyone else already knew by heart. As we moved toward the dining room, his hand remained at my back, guiding but not forcing, a quiet constant that I was becoming too aware of, and I hated that awareness, hated how my body responded to it before my mind could catch up. We took our seats, and everything continued as if nothing had changed, conversation flowing, plates being passed, laughter soft and easy, but underneath it all, I could feel it. The expectation, the assumption, the quiet certainty that I was not just visiting, that I was part of this now. And the worst part was not that they believed it. It was that for brief, dangerous moments, I almost did too. It happened halfway through dinner, in the middle of something completely normal, something so ordinary it should have been forgettable, which was exactly why it caught me off guard. Mrs. Carter was asking about my work, her tone warm but precise, the kind of interest that felt genuine but also carefully measured, like she was building a profile in real time, and I answered as smoothly as I could, falling into the version of myself that fit this setting, polished but not too polished, honest, but not too revealing. Alex sat beside me, quiet, composed, only speaking when necessary, but I could feel him there, steady and constant, his presence like a line I could not cross even if I wanted to. "And how did the two of you meet?" his father asked, his voice calm but sharper than the rest, the kind of question that sounded casual but carried weight underneath. I felt it immediately, that shift, that subtle tightening in the air, and for a fraction of a second, I froze. Because this was not part of the details we had discussed, not something I had prepared for. My mind scrambled, flipping through possibilities, trying to land on something believable, something that would fit the narrative Alex had already built. And then his hand moved, just slightly, brushing against mine under the table, a small, grounding touch that steadied me more than it should have. "We met at a charity event," I said, the words coming out smoother than I expected, like they had been waiting somewhere in the back of my mind, ready to be used. I felt Alex's gaze shift toward me, not surprised, not questioning, just attentive, like he was watching to see how far I would go. He spilled coffee on me. I added, glancing at him briefly, letting a hint of humor slip into my tone, something light, something easy. There was a pause, just long enough to feel it, and then Mrs. Carter laughed softly, the tension dissolving like it had never been there. "That sounds like Alex," she said, amused, and I caught the smallest shift in Alex's posture beside me, something that almost felt like relief. I exhaled slowly, not realizing I had been holding my breath, and for a moment, everything felt manageable. Conversation moved on, the rhythm of the evening picking back up, and I let myself relax just slightly, just enough to keep going without overthinking every word. But then it happened again, smaller this time, quieter, but somehow more dangerous. Alex's fingers brushed mine. Once more, not accidental, not fleeting, but deliberate, a light press that lingered just long enough to feel intentional. I stilled, my breath catching slightly, my attention snapping back to him even as I tried to keep my focus on the conversation around us. He did not look at me, did not acknowledge it outwardly, but the touch remained for a second longer before he pulled back, and the absence of it felt just as noticeable. I swallowed, forcing myself to stay composed, to keep playing the role, because that was what this was supposed to be, a role, a performance, something controlled and temporary. But the problem was the way it felt, the way those small moments lingered longer than they should have, the way they made everything blur just slightly at the edges. By the time dinner ended, I was not just acting anymore. I was responding, reacting, adjusting in ways that felt instinctive instead of calculated, and that was dangerous. As we stood, chairs shifting softly against the floor, Mrs. Carter reached for my hand again, her smile warm and certain, and for a brief, unsettling moment, I realized something I had not fully processed until now. They were not testing me to see if I fit into this family. They were treating me like I already did, and the more I played along, the harder it was becoming to remember where the performance ended and something else began. It should have ended after dinner. That was what I told myself as I followed the others back into the living room. That once the plates were cleared and the questions faded into polite conversation, I would finally have a moment to breathe, to step back and remember that this was still temporary, still something I could control. But the problem was the way everything kept continuing as if there was no ending point at all. Like this was not a visit, not a performance, but something ongoing, something expected. Mrs. Carter guided me to sit beside her on the sofa, her hand resting lightly on my arm in a way that felt affectionate, familiar, like she had done it 100 times before, and I let it happen because pulling away would mean explaining why, and I was running out of explanations that did not unravel everything. "You must be tired," she said softly, her tone carrying a quiet understanding that made it harder to resist. "It has been a long day for you." And I nodded. Automatically, even though the exhaustion I felt had nothing to do with travel or conversation and everything to do with trying to keep my footing in something that kept shifting under me. Across the room, Alex stood near the fireplace, speaking quietly with his father, their conversation low and measured, but I could feel his attention flicker back to me every so often, like he was tracking where I was, what I was doing, whether I was still holding the line we had set. The thought should have annoyed me, should have made me feel controlled, but instead it grounded me in a way I did not want to admit. "We are hosting a small gathering this weekend," Mrs. Carter continued, her fingers brushing lightly against my sleeve as she spoke. "Just close friends, nothing overwhelming, but it would be lovely for everyone to meet you properly." My breath caught slightly, the words settling in slower than they should have, because that was not part of any one-week arrangement. That was something that extended beyond it, something that assumed I would still be here, still in this role, still part of this weekend. I repeated, my voice careful, neutral, even as my mind started racing ahead, calculating timelines, counting days, trying to find where this fit into the boundaries I had set for myself. She smiled at me, warm and certain, like the answer was already decided, like my hesitation was just a formality. "Of course," she said. "It is important for the people close to us to know who you are." I glanced up instinctively, my gaze finding Alex across the room, and for a moment everything else faded. The conversation, the room, the quiet hum of voices, because the look he gave me was steady, unwavering, like he had been waiting for this moment, like he already knew what I was thinking before I said it. I held his gaze, searching for something, some sign that this could still be contained, that this was still within the limits of what we agreed to, but what I found instead was something else entirely, something that made my chest tighten in a way I could not easily explain. "That sounds nice," I said finally, the words leaving my mouth before I could fully process them, before I could stop them, and the moment they did, I felt it, that shift, subtle but undeniable, like I had just stepped further into something I was not sure how to step out of. Mrs. Carter's smile widened slightly, satisfied, and she gave my hand a gentle squeeze, as if sealing the decision. Across the room, Alex did not smile, did not react outwardly at all, but there was something in his eyes, something quieter, something that looked almost like relief, and that was the part that unsettled me the most, because it meant this was not just happening around me anymore. It was happening with me, and I was no longer just keeping up. I was moving forward with it. The moment the words left my mouth, I felt it, that quiet shift settling deeper into place, like something invisible had just locked another piece of this into position, and I could not take it back even if I tried. The conversation around me continued as if nothing had changed, laughter soft, voices blending into a calm rhythm. But underneath it all, I could feel the weight of what I had just agreed to pressing against my chest, steady and undeniable. I excused myself not long after, my smile polite, my movements careful, and no one stopped me, no one questioned it, which somehow made it easier and harder at the same time. The hallway was quieter now, the lights dimmer, casting soft shadows that stretched along the walls as I walked, my steps slower than before, like I was giving myself time to think, to process, to find some version of control again. But the problem was every thought led back to the same place. The same realization that this was expanding beyond the boundaries I had set, beyond the simple, contained version of the plan I had agreed to. I reached my room and closed the door behind me. The soft click louder than it should have been, and for a second I just stood there, my back against the wood, my eyes closing as I let out a breath I had been holding for too long. This is getting out of hand, I murmured to myself, the words quiet but firm, like I was trying to anchor them in something solid. I pushed away from the door and crossed the room, my gaze drifting to the ring again. Always the ring, like it was the center of everything, the small detail that had quietly turned into something much bigger. I slipped it off this time, slowly, carefully, and held it in my palm, the metal cool against my skin, lighter than it felt when it was on my finger, like it carried less weight when it was not attached to me. For a moment, I just stared at it, turning it slightly, watching how it caught the light, how perfect it looked, how permanent it felt. Despite everything, it is just a prop, I said under my breath, trying to convince myself, trying to strip it back to what it was supposed to be, something temporary, something controlled. But even as I said it, the words did not settle right, because nothing about this felt like a prop anymore. A soft knock at the door interrupted the thought, quieter than before, more deliberate, and I did not need to ask who it was. "Come in," I said, my voice steady enough. Even as my fingers curled slightly around the ring, the door opened slowly, and Alex stepped inside, his presence immediate, filling the space in a way that made the room feel smaller without him needing to do anything at all. His gaze dropped briefly to my hand, to the ring I was no longer wearing, and something flickered there, quick and sharp before it smoothed out again. "You left early," he said, his tone neutral, but there was something underneath it, something quieter, harder to define. I let out a small breath, setting the ring down on the table. Beside me, the soft clink louder than expected in the stillness. "Your mother invited me to a gathering this weekend," I replied, meeting his gaze directly, because avoiding it would only make this harder. His expression did not change, but I could see it, that subtle shift in his eyes, like he had been waiting for me to bring it up. "I know," he said simply. I crossed my arms, a reflex more than anything else, grounding myself in something physical as the weight of the situation settled back. "That is not part of 1 week," I said, and this time there was no hesitation, no softness, just the truth as I saw it. He stepped closer, slow and deliberate, stopping just within reach, not crowding me, not forcing anything, but close enough that I could feel the difference. "It is part of making it believable," he replied, his voice lower now, steady in a way that made it hard to argue even when I wanted to. I shook my head slightly, my gaze dropping for a second before lifting again, sharper this time. "Or it is part of making it permanent," I said, and the words hung there between us, heavier than anything else we had said tonight. For a moment, neither of us moved, the silence stretching, but not breaking, just settling into something that felt like a line we were both aware of. And then Alex's gaze shifted briefly to the ring on the table before returning to me, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but somehow more certain than before. "Put it back on," he said, not as a command, not quite, but close enough that it made my pulse falter, because the way he said it did not sound like part of the act anymore. It sounded like something else entirely. I did not move right away, and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything we had said before, stretching between us like a question neither of us wanted to answer too quickly. My eyes dropped to the ring on the table, the the small circle of metal that had somehow become the center of everything. And for a second, I just stared at it, my fingers twitching slightly at my side like they already knew what he was asking before my mind could catch up. Why? I asked finally, my voice quieter than I intended, because this was not just about the act anymore, not just about appearances or playing along for his family. This felt different, deeper in a way that made it harder to ignore. Alex did not hesitate this time, and that alone made my chest tighten, because hesitation would have meant uncertainty, and uncertainty would have given me something to push against. Because you already agreed, he said, calm and steady. But there was something else under it, something that made the words land heavier than they should have, like they carried more meaning than just the surface of them. I let out a short breath, shaking my head slightly as I stepped closer to the table, my gaze still fixed on the ring, because looking at him right now felt too much like giving in to something I did not fully understand. I agreed to a week, I said, softer now, my fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the table, grounding myself in something solid, something real. Not this, he moved. Then, just one step, but it was enough to shift the space between us again, enough to make me aware of him in a way that was impossible to ignore. This is still that, he replied, his voice lower now, closer, like he was narrowing the gap, not just physically but in the conversation itself. I let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it, just disbelief, just the weight of everything that had built up over the past few hours. You keep saying that, I said, finally lifting my eyes to meet his, holding his gaze even though it would have been easier not to. But it does not feel like it anymore. For a moment, something shifted in his expression, something that looked almost like frustration, or maybe something more complicated, something he was not used to dealing with. His hand lifted slightly, hesitating in the space between us before he let it fall back to his side, like he had thought about reaching for me and decided against it. Then what does it feel like? He asked, and the question caught me off guard, not because I did not have an answer, but because I did, and saying it out loud would make it real in a way I was not sure I was ready for. I swallowed, my gaze flickering briefly, away before returning to him, because avoiding it would only delay the inevitable. It feels like I am already part of something I did not choose, I said, the words steady but quieter now, more honest than anything I had said so far. The room fell silent again, but this time it was different, not tense, not sharp, just heavy, like the weight of what I had said had settled into the space between us. Alex looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable at first, and then something softened, not completely, not enough to make this simple, but enough to make it real. You are, he said, and there was no hesitation, no attempt to soften it, just the truth as he saw it. My breath caught slightly, my fingers curling instinctively at my sides, because hearing it said out loud hit differently than thinking it. Heavier, harder to push away. That is not fair, I said, but the words came out weaker than I intended, because part of me already knew fairness was not what this was about. He stepped closer again, just enough that the distance between us felt intentional, controlled, and when he spoke this time, his voice was quieter, but somehow more certain than before. No, he agreed. And for a second, I thought that was all he would say, that he would leave it there, but then his gaze dropped briefly to the ring before lifting back to mine, steady and unwavering. But it is real, he added, and that was the part that stayed with me, the part that echoed in the quiet after, because it was no longer about pretending, no longer about making anyone believe anything. It was about the fact that somewhere along the way, this had stopped being an act, and I did not know when that had happened or how to undo it now that it had. The word real did not leave the room when he said it. It stayed, settled somewhere between us like something tangible, something I could almost reach out and touch if I was not careful. And that was exactly what made it dangerous, because real was not part of the plan. Real was not something I had agreed to, and yet here it was, woven into everything whether I wanted it or not. I looked at him, really looked this time, searching for something that would make this easier to define, easier to reject, but all I found was that same quiet certainty, that same unwavering presence that had been pulling me in from the beginning. You do not get to decide that for both of us, I said, my voice steady but softer now, because arguing felt different when the lines were no longer clear. Alex did not interrupt. did not push back immediately, and that pause gave me just enough space to breathe, to gather the thoughts that had been circling without direction. This was supposed to be simple. I continued, glancing briefly at the ring before looking back at him. A roll, a week, an exit. The words sounded thinner now, like they belonged to a version of this that no longer existed. He took another step closer, slow and deliberate, and this time I did not move away, not because I agreed, but because I needed to understand how we had ended up here. It can still be that, he said, but there was something in his tone that told me he did not fully believe it either, like he was offering me a way out he already knew I would not take. I let out a quiet breath, shaking my head slightly, because that was the problem. The way out was still there, visible, reachable, but it did not feel real anymore, not compared to everything else pressing in around it. Then why does it not feel like it? I asked, and this time the question was not defensive, not challenging, just honest in a way that made it harder to ignore. For a moment, he did not answer, and in that silence, I saw it, the shift, subtle but undeniable, the way his expression softened at the edges, like he was no longer trying to control the outcome as tightly as before. His gaze dropped briefly to my hand, to the empty space where the ring had been, and when it lifted again, there was something different there, something quieter, something that felt closer to truth than anything he had said so far. Because you are not pretending anymore, he said, and the words landed with a weight that made my breath catch. Because I did not have an immediate argument for that. No quick denial, no easy way to push it aside. I swallowed, my fingers curling slightly as I tried to find something to hold on to, something that still made sense in the middle of this, but everything felt blurred now. The lines between choice and circumstance, between acting and reacting. That does not mean I chose this, I said after a moment, quieter now, because this was not about winning. It was about understanding where I still had control. He nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but it mattered because it meant he was listening, not just responding. No, he agreed, and for a second, that felt like something solid, something I could stand on, until he stepped just a little closer, closing the space between us enough that I could feel the shift in the air again. But you are still here, he added, and that was the part that settled deeper than anything else, because it was true, painfully, undeniably true. I glanced toward the door, still closed, still there, the same door that had been an exit from the beginning, and for a brief moment, I imagined walking through it, stepping out, leaving all of this behind like it had never happened. But the image did not hold. It faded too quickly, replaced by the reality of where I was standing now. My gaze dropped to the ring on the table once more, and this time when I reached for it, my fingers did not hesitate, not because I was sure, but because I needed to understand what it meant to put it back on. I turned it once in my hand, feeling the weight of it, the quiet pull of everything it represented, before sliding it slowly back onto my finger. The metal settling into place with a familiarity that felt both wrong and inevitable at the same time. And when I looked back up at him, there was no clear answer in my expression, no certainty, just the quiet realization that whatever this was, I was no longer standing outside of it. The ring settled into place like it had been waiting for that exact moment, like it recognized the shape of my hand better than I did. And for a second neither of us moved, the silence stretching between us in a way that no longer felt uncertain, just heavy with everything that had not been said out loud. Alex's gaze dropped to my hand, lingering there for a fraction longer than necessary, and when it lifted back to my face, something had shifted, not dramatically, not enough to change the room, but enough that I felt it, a quiet release of tension I had not realized he was holding. Okay, he said softly, and it was such a simple word, so understated, but it carried more weight than anything else he had said so far, because it sounded less like control and more like acknowledgement. I let out a slow breath, my fingers flexing slightly as I adjusted to the feel of the ring again, heavier now, not because it had changed, but because I had. This does not mean I am staying forever, I said, the words steady but quieter, not defensive, not confrontational, just something I needed to say, something I needed to hold on to. He nodded once, immediate, without hesitation, and that should have made it easier, should have reassured me, but instead it made something in my chest tighten, because it felt like he was giving me the answer I needed without actually letting go of anything else. 1 week, he replied, his voice calm, measured, like we were returning to something familiar, something structured. And for a moment, I almost believed it again, almost let myself settle back into that version of this where everything had clear edges and a defined end. Almost. I glanced down at my hand once more, at the way the ring caught the light, at how natural it looked there despite everything. And I hated how quickly my mind started adjusting to it, how easily it began to feel less like a foreign object and more like something that belonged. Then we stick to that, I said, more to myself. Then to him, like I was reinforcing the boundary before it shifted again. He did not argue, did not push, and that silence felt different now, not like resistance, but like patience, like he was waiting for something I had not fully realized yet. After a moment, he stepped back slightly, giving me space, real space this time, and the absence of his presence felt just as noticeable as when he was close. There is something else, he said, his tone shifting just enough to catch my attention, and I looked up, my focus sharpening again, because that phrasing had become familiar in a way I did not trust. What? I asked, cautious now, aware of how quickly things could change with a single sentence. He held my gaze for a second longer than necessary, like he was choosing his words carefully, and that alone made my pulse pick up slightly. The gathering this weekend, he continued, his voice steady but quieter than before. It is not just friends. I frowned slightly, confusion flickering. And before I could stop it, because that was not what his mother had said, not how it had been presented. Then what is it? I asked, my voice slower now, more deliberate. He hesitated for just a fraction of a second, and that was all it took for something cold to settle in my chest, because hesitation from him meant this mattered. It is where they make it official, he said, and the words landed differently than everything else, sharper, clearer, cutting through the layers of uncertainty that had been building. I blinked, my breath catching slightly as my gaze dropped instinctively to the ring, to the small, perfect symbol of something I had thought was temporary. Official, I repeated. Quieter now, because suddenly the timeline I had been holding onto did not feel as stable as I thought. He nodded once, slow, certain, and when I looked back up at him, whatever I had been about to say disappeared, because the look in his eyes was not one of doubt or hesitation. It was something else entirely, something steady and unwavering. You can still walk away, he said, and the words sounded like an option, like a choice. But the way he looked at me made it feel like something else. Something heavier, something that carried more than just the possibility of leaving. I stood there for a long moment, the room quiet around us, my thoughts pulling in different directions, the door still there, still open if I wanted it to be, and yet my hand remained where it was, the ring still in place, my pulse steadying instead of racing. Not yet, I said finally, the words leaving my mouth before I could stop them. And the moment they did, I felt it, that shift again, deeper this time. Like I had just crossed a line I could not uncross, and whatever this was, whatever it had become, it was no longer something I was just passing through, it was something I was stepping into.